Hello, my name is Colin Selby and I want to talk with you about the use of assessment in the work context. The purpose of the session is to provide you with some definitions of assessment and psychological assessment in particular, and I also want to describe the assessment process, which is becoming increasingly common in use in Europe and around the world. Where do we begin? Well, I suppose the first recorded use of assessment is the place to begin, and that was in China between 4,000 and 4,500 years ago, when assessment was carried out with people who'd been injured fighting. Could they be rehabilitated? Could they contribute to society in some way in spite of their disability? A similar approach was taken to assessment until about the Second World War, when assessment began to be used to evaluate teams who had to work together in the wartime scenario. For example, gun crews on warships. If one person froze, the whole team was incapacitated. The use of assessment in employment in general has really developed momentum over the last 15 to 20 years in the UK and in Europe, and of course very widely in other countries around the world. Typically, people seeking employment can anticipate some form of assessment, and I'll describe some of those in a moment. Perhaps it's useful if we start with some definitions to provide a framework within which we can then explore this topic. A psychological test can be defined as a method of reliably establishing or measuring a facet of individual behaviour against agreed criteria for a valid purpose. It's important probably to say that some of you use the words psychological and psychometric interchangeably. Psychology is the study of behaviour and psychometry is the measurement of behaviour. Psychometric questionnaires evaluate someone so they can be fairly compared with a relevant reference group. Some psychological questionnaires are not psychometric and they provide a description of the person's particular approach to a number of topics. All psychometric questionnaires are psychological questionnaires. We make some assumptions when we're using and developing questionnaires. First of all, we assume that people vary their behaviour, their response to a given stimulus. For example, if somebody was to approach a group of people and prick each of them, stimulate them we call it, with a pin, it's probably fair to assume that people would respond with a range of different reactions, some with pain, some with pleasure, some with humour, some with anger, some with violence. Perhaps some would try to ignore the event completely. If we prick sufficient people with a pin, we can start to generalise about the responses which people produce. We could say that X% respond with pain, Y% with pleasure, and so on. Now, if we assume that the person using the pin has a particular motive in mind, that means that they are looking to find who or what the incidence is of response, for example, with pain. So we can generalise after a while about what proportion of the population respond in what kind of way. That's a very capsule description of the way in which we develop psychological questionnaires. Let's go on, and what I'm going to try to do now is to describe to you the range of assessments which can be carried out in the employment context, and I am talking particularly about the employment context. Imagine, if you will, the image of a lily with the leaf resting on the surface of the water, the stem going down through the water, becoming progressively more murky as you go down towards the silt at the base of the pond or lake, and the roots spreading out in the silt. If you imagine this as a person's behaviour, it's probably easy to see that if we want to assess somebody's knowledge, skills and ability, these are things which, if you will, would appear above the water's surface. We talk with people, we have simple questionnaires that they can complete, and these do give us a picture because people are not trying to hide these things and they are fairly changeable through training and education. If you then penetrate below the surface of the pond, it becomes progressively murkier. That is, it becomes more difficult to accurately identify how someone's going to behave in a given situation. So beneath the surface of the water you have interests and then progressively values. Identifying somebody's work values, is work a central life interest? Identifying their religious values and their political values particularly can be quite difficult. As you progress down and you come to personality and temperament, it's more difficult still. The person may not be aware of their own behaviour. It may take you more time to carry out the assessment. And as you go into the silt and you're looking at disposition and motivation, it's extraordinarily difficult to accurately identify how somebody is going to behave in a given situation. And yet, when you're employing people with a career in mind, it seems to me that's exactly what you want to know. That's the challenge the psychologist and the test user faces. Let's imagine a scale of things which can be assessed, ranging from height at the top of the scale down to emotional stability at the lower end. If I was to ask a group of people to arrange themselves along the wall in a room, with the shortest on the left and the tallest on the right, it's probably fair to assume they could handle that task without a great deal of difficulty, and they could achieve a fairly accurate result measured visually. And they could probably do that without consultant support, and they could do that probably with one or other of their senses disconnected. If we then were to say, well, can you do the same thing with respect to weight, which is similarly not a complex task, some other factors come into the mix. People may not know how much they weigh. They may not care to disclose how much they weigh, and therefore you might start to want some independent or third-party support, a pair of scales, a consultant with a pair of scales perhaps. Now, as you go down the scale of things you can evaluate through abilities, through skills, through interests, values, down to personality, bear in mind, as I said, I think it's personality that you're particularly concerned about when employing and developing someone's career. Three things occur. First, it takes you longer to carry out the assessment. Secondly, you need more expert third-party help, psychological questionnaires. And thirdly, the level of precision you achieve declines. Now, these techniques can be used in combination to carry out a range of assessments in order to predict somebody's work performance. Let's talk about some of these techniques. In the major studies which I've seen, graphology and astrology, that's handwriting analysis and birth chart analysis, tend to provide a poor prediction of work performance. References provide a similarly unsatisfactory level of prediction, A, because many employers won't do anything more than confirm someone's dates of employment, and B, because they're becoming defensive quite frequently in the way in which they word such things. Bear in mind that we're comparing these things with each other and against perfect prediction of work behaviour. Next up the scale, we have typical interviews, the sort of interview that's ill prepared for, where the requirement for the job is unclear, and that's squeezed in between other real brackets work activity. Above that, we have structured interviews, where the questions which are asked have been chosen because they are characteristic of people who are successfully doing the job, which is the focus of the selection activity. This improves the level of precision considerably. Next up the scale, we have the structured interview converted into a questionnaire, which we call a biodata questionnaire, where the candidate is asked questions, the answers to which have been derived from people who are already judged to be successful in the job which is being selected for. So these questionnaires ask about previous work, previous activities, and they're used as the basis for predicting performance on the job. Above this, in terms of rising up the scale of reliability of predicting behaviour in work, we come to personality tests. And it's interesting to note that the majority of studies in this area indicate clearly that you need to use a combination of questionnaires. You won't satisfy the requirements for a job role by using a single questionnaire. Next up the scale, and we're combining activities here, we come to the assessment centre which is being used to select somebody for employment. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with this, the assessment centre is a situation where a number of candidates undertake a number of tasks, and while they do this, they are being observed by people in the organisation, usually managers, who've been trained to relate the candidate's performance on the tasks to the job requirement. The tasks themselves have been selected because they are characteristic of the work that the person will have to do if they're employed. This tends to combine personality assessment, interviews, and a number of other characteristic activities like in-trays or group discussions. So you get a kind of sampling of the job, and the activities can range from half a day in duration through to a number of weeks, although typically a day or two is what occurs. Next up the scale of prediction of behaviour are ability tests, measures of numeracy, language, and other sorts of intellectual capability. Now, these are powerful predictors of work performance where they are relevant, and I would argue they're probably relevant mostly in areas where you don't have much evidence of educational attainment from the candidate or evidence of work experience because they haven't perhaps been employed before. However, once somebody has 5 or 7 years of work experience, the discriminability, the capability of these measures to validly discriminate between people, I would argue, declines strongly. As we go up the scale, and we're into the very high levels of work prediction now, we have work sample tests where the person has a trial on the job, as it were. And finally, we come to the assessment centre, similar to the previous one I mentioned, but where the person's already an employee. So you have evidence of their work capability to add to the understanding derived from the event itself. There are two kinds of assessment tool available. Let me describe these briefly to you. The first one is the measure of maximum performance. A test, which measures how well someone can do something, how much they know, how great their potential is. These are measures where people have to answer questions with right or wrong answers. So these are the questionnaires from which is derived the pass, fail, good, bad, yes, no worries that sometimes people have about the use of assessment. Typically, these are ability tests, attainment tests, and aptitude tests, and I'll describe their broad characteristics in a moment. The other kind of questionnaire, and this is, I would argue, what you're primarily interested in when evaluating somebody for a career of employment, are the measures of typical performance, which measure what sort of work people like or want to do, and they include measures of personality, interest, and values. The difference between these two kinds of tool are really quite striking. They are both multiple choice questionnaires typically. However, the measure of maximum performance usually has a time, so you're working against the clock, it's a measure of speed perhaps, and it usually values higher scores more than lower scores, bearing in mind that people get questions right or wrong. By contrast, the measure of typical performance is characterised by multiple choice, as I said. It's typically untimed, so you work at your own speed. Differences in speed are not measured, and it's a desirable profile with which the person is matched. It's not a right or wrong answer. People give opinions to questions. So, I've talked with you about questionnaires in general and assessment techniques and some specific differences between different ways that you can evaluate the person. How widely used are these? If you apply for a job, are you likely to encounter these as part of the job application process? Well, over the last 15 years, particularly in the last decade, there's been an explosive geometric growth in the use of such materials. Whereas, for example, 10 years ago, you might have a 1 in 8 chance of being asked to complete a personality questionnaire if you apply for a management job. Now, it's a better than even chance that you'll be asked to complete such a questionnaire, a better than 50-50 chance. And that sort of growth is also characteristic of other kinds of assessment, including the interview as well. Let's now look at the media through which assessment can be undertaken. There are two choices available to you. On the one hand, the paper and pencil scenario, where you might contemplate a room full of candidates answering questionnaires, and this is derived from the ability-based scenario, as you can imagine, the examination context, and the computer-aided scenario, where the person sits in front of a computer screen and answers questions on a normal or simplified keyboard. Keyboard skills are not generally a factor, by the way. What are the differences? Well, let me take it from the computer-aided perspective. The computer-aided approach means that the candidate controls the speed at which the instructions are administered, so understanding the instructions ceases to be a part of the assessment process. Secondly, one question at a time usually is presented on screen, and this enables the candidate to focus more clearly on what it is they're supposed to do. It has other payoffs, which I'll describe in a moment. The social dynamic is changed. The administrator is there to settle them and reassure them. The administrator is not an invigilator, with all the concomitant stress that can invoke. With the computer-aided process, feedback is available as quickly as the printer permits. It's instant. The candidate has increased ownership of the results. They feel they've been more involved in the assessment process. This is an impression more than a fact, of course. There's no need for a highly qualified and trained administrator. They need training, but the training requirement is simplified because the computer administers the instructions in an absolutely standard and therefore even way. Senior people find the computer-aided process more acceptable. I suppose they appreciate the investment that the computer represents and the relative seclusion of the assessment process. There's an increased reliability associated with the use of computer-aided assessment. First of all, people answer more candidly, more truthfully, whether they're aware of it or not, and this is consistently the case with a whole range of research. Secondly, there's less chance of faking because you only have one item on the screen at a time and you can't go backwards. And thirdly, the data is more secure than on paper. We've done exit interviews, and candidates very frequently say that they see the computer as more trustworthy, more friendly than a face-to-face assessor or a paper and pencil scenario. Interestingly, irrespective of computer familiarity, people prefer the computer-aided process, and even people who don't like computers prefer the computer-aided assessment to paper and pencil equivalent. It saves you money. That must be a powerful argument. It's less cost on administrator, advisor or interpreter, and respondent time. People do it about a third quicker on screen than they do on paper. However, to finish off, let me give you a word of caution. Before you consider using any of these techniques, which are very attractively packaged and really quite whizzy in many people's minds, please bear in mind that you need to be clear what it is you want to know about somebody before you begin to select questionnaires and undertake the assessment process. You must be clear what the competencies are before you start the assessment process. Otherwise, you gather a lot of information which you can't validly use in the work setting. Thank you for listening to this. I hope you found it useful.